Hi, it's Stu Richards. Thank you for joining me today on our latest Fastcast. Today we're going to be covering new research on the SMB business outlook and spending plans. I'm excited to have you join me today. While we have folks log in, what I wanted to do for those of you who aren't familiar with Bredin is give you a little bit of a background on who we are and what we do to help companies market to the small and mid-sized business audience. By the way, that sometimes raises a question of what do we mean when we say SMB? We tend to think of small businesses as under, well, say 20 to 100 employees. Big or mid-sized businesses, roughly 100 to 500. But every client we've worked with has a different definition of a sweet spot in the SMB space, whether it's looking at them by revenue, by headcount, or by industry, by stage of growth, you name it. As you can see by the logos of the folks that we've worked with, we've helped clients in a wide range of industries to either understand SMBs through custom research or to engage with them via content or both. In terms of research, you can see on the left the kinds of topics we've covered for clients with either custom or shared client research. Methodologically, we're pretty agnostic. We can do qualitative or quantitative research, and we can provide a variety of analytics depending on what your research objectives are. The ultimate goal of the research that we conduct really varies, but fundamentally, it might be to support outbound programs like content, collateral, PR, social, or it might be to support an understanding of internal strategy, for example, the customer experience or best media to use for go-to-market. Or other factors. The other thing that we do, as I mentioned, is develop communication programs. Those can, of course, be based on research that we do, or might be third-party research that you already have, or it might be completely separate. We can develop content that's more focused on providing advice or how-to content as opposed to research reports. But regardless of the topic, you can see in the center of this slide the kinds of formats we provide. And regardless, again, of whether it's data-based or how-to, and regardless of the format, the goal of the content that we create for you is to help enhance your position as a trusted advisor to the small business audience and help small business owners or various head of line of business folks understand how your offerings can help them to achieve their business goals. So with that commercial from your sponsor, what I wanted to do is to get into the topic at hand, which is, of course, what the SMB business outlook is and what their spending plans are. Actually, we'll cover a number of things around, kind of current business status, their priorities and challenges, their application usage. So we took a little bit of a dive into the various software categories that they may or may not be using, and if not, what their purchase intent is. We also looked at credit usage and job site usage at a very high level. And we asked about a variety of brands, how much they are either aware of brands or trust them. And in this research, we've also provided some comparisons to a similar study that we did back in May. So we have kind of a 6-month check-in. So here's what we did. We surveyed 500 principals, meaning founder, owner, partner, senior director, president, CEO, someone like that, at the top of their organization, at 500 US businesses with anywhere from 1 to 500 employees. As I mentioned, we ran that same kind of survey in May. We did stratify the sample by size. So 250 of the respondents in each survey we did, both in November and in May, had anywhere from 1 to 19 employees. We call those very small businesses, or VSBs. That's how we'll describe them throughout the deck. Another 150 were from companies with 20 to 99 employees, and the remainder, those with 100 to 500 employees. We call those mid-sized businesses, or MBs. When we present the data in total, we weight it according to their representation in the US SMB universe. So Of all companies in the United States that have fewer than 500 employees, 97.7% of them have fewer than 20 employees. So, basically almost all of them. 2% have 20 to 99 and 0.3% have 100 to 500. So when we weight the data, we're effectively throwing away all responses from companies with greater than 20 employees. And so we do tend to break out the responses to show what the differences are by company size, which tend to be pretty dramatic. And we have provided, where relevant, significant test results. And you can see the difference in percentage score, whether it's within a sample by company size or from wave to wave, from May to November. It's about a 9-point difference to me, meaningful between VSBs, 12 points for SBs, and 14 points for the mid-sized businesses. The research that we just ran, we fielded from October 22nd to November 10th. The May survey we did, it was at the end of May to beginning of June. And I think that's probably enough. By the way, if you want a copy of this, I'm more than happy to send you this deck after the call. You don't feel like you need to take a screen grab or notes or anything like this. I can also send you the recording if you'd like it. There's a fair amount of data in here, both on the sample itself and the responses. So if you'd like a copy of this deck for further detail, please reach out to me. Just a note again on who participated in this research. As you can see, they had to be principal of the organization. We did the breakup by company size. Operational status, we did ask if they're open for business completely, based on the pandemic, open for business on a limited basis, or closed but plan to reopen. We did terminate if they're closed permanently. We asked about their company age, their revenue, their business outlook, which you can see about half of them expect to grow by double digits this year, which is quite positive. We asked where they're from, both in terms of region as well as population density. So are they in a city, suburbs, some kind of rural area? And we did break out the respondents by industry as well. And we asked some demographic questions as well: gender, age, political affiliation, race, and education level. And we'll touch on those at the end of this presentation. So the very first question that we asked was, again, a little bit deeper dive on their current company situation. So they could either be in dark blue, fully operational, and you can see the May results on the left. So 77% of the very smallest businesses were fully operational. That's increased by 1% to November. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the small businesses, 69% of them were fully open in May. Now 77% of them are in November. And likewise for the biggest businesses, 59% were fully operational in May compared to 84%, huge jump. That's statistically significant, hence the arrow from wave to wave. So overall, that's very positive about how SMBs, and especially larger SMBs, are recovering from the pandemic. Another question that we asked was how their spending outlook has changed as a result of COVID-19. You can see the May responses on the bottom, broken out by company size, small businesses on the left over to the biggest businesses on the right, and in the top here at the November data. The dark blue means they're more cost conscious as a general rule, and will spend conservatively, whether that's because, for example, their top line has been affected by, consumers or their customers curtailing spending, or profits have been curtailed as a result of, inflation or supply chain issues. The takeaway here is that since November, businesses have become a little bit more cost conscious overall, especially the very smallest businesses went from 41% in May saying they're more cost conscious to 68% in November. It's effectively unchanged. Maybe you might say MBs, the biggest businesses, are actually a little bit more optimistic. And we'll see, it's interesting as we go through this deck, there's very contradictory responses from SMEs. In some cases, you'll see that they feel more optimistic about their business outlook. In other ways, you'll see that they don't. So it's a very, kind of cloudy picture for a lot of small businesses as they face a lot of headwinds around, again, either revenue based on, their customers' confidence or purchase behavior, or profitability based on supply chain or inflation or, what's happening with Omicron. So to get at that, one of the questions that we asked was their time to return to quote unquote normal. Normal we just defined as, pre-pandemic. So here we just said, okay, how long do you think it's going to take for you to return to your pre-pandemic staffing or headcount, whatever that was. The top bars are for the total sample that's weighted, so it's very similar to the very smallest business responses. If you look at VSBs, it's interesting. The May bar, 77% of very small businesses in May said they'd already returned to full staffing as of May. And in November, only 66% of them said they have, which actually says that they may have either had folks resign or retire, or they've had to lay folks off. For SBs and MBs, they've gone in a different direction. From May to November, they tend to be higher in terms of they've already returned to full staffing. But the big takeaway, if you look at the little red kind of vertical bars, those sum up the differences or expectations for 2021. So in May, we asked about, either they already have or they expected to in the first half of the year, or they expected to by the end of 2021 to return to their pre-pandemic headcount. And you can see about 90% of VSBs in May expected to return to full headcount by the end of the year. And that's dropped down pretty significantly by November. Only about, 80% now expect to be fully staffed, pre-pandemic equivalent by the end of the year. So a little bit of a decrease in optimism, at least in terms of how they expect staffing, how long they expect it's going to take them to return to full staffing. And again, a variety of drivers for that, whether it's revenue to afford full staffing or being able to retain employees as a result of the Great Resignation. Another aspect that we wanted to get at was their expectations around returning to pre-pandemic revenue. So same question, actually, this was all in the same question for them. And you can see the very same dynamic holds where in May, businesses, regardless of size, were generally more optimistic. And there's been quite a drop-off in expectations among the very small businesses in terms of how likely they are to return to pre-pandemic revenue by the end of this year. For SBs and especially MBs, they have both fallen a little bit, but the drop-off is much less significant than it is for VSBs. So big takeaway is, they're a little bit less or a lot less, if you're a VSB, optimistic about returning to full pre-pandemic revenue by the end of 2021. And then the last part of the question is profitability, and very much the same dynamic as staffing and revenue, where in every case, and especially for VSBs, their expectations for returning to full profitability by the end of this year are lower now in November than they were in May. Another way we wanted to gauge SMB, kind of business outlook was to ask them across a variety of metrics, their optimism. Now, this is on a scale of 1 to 100. There was a little slider that they could use to respond to each of these 10 different metrics around business management. Business confidence overall, and you can see since May, for example, business confidence in aggregate, everyone weighted data has bumped from 66 to 69, on a scale of 1 to 100. And you can see expansion, they've actually all increased, but expansion has started from a lower base, as has hiring, but they both increased more. And it's interesting, despite what we just saw about decreased expectations to return to pre-pandemic revenue and profitability, SMBs are still in aggregate more optimistic than they were in May, and that speaks to ongoing SMB optimism as a general rule. They do tend to be a very optimistic or positive group. This is a continuation of the same question, 5 other metrics that we asked about. And again, you can see in every case, optimism is increased to varying degrees across the board. It's a little bit more interesting, and again, there's kind of a lot going on this slide, but it's a little more interesting to look at these metrics by company size. So what you'll see is there's a very clear pattern. The bigger the company, and you can see in kind of gold is the responses for the VSBs, lighter gold for May, darker gold for November. SBs are in blue, again, lighter in May, darker in blue, and MBs here are in red. So in every case, the optimism increases with company size, and that's something we see, again and again and again in our research around, all kinds of attributes with SMBs. And optimism has increased more among smaller businesses from May to November than it has among bigger businesses. What's also interesting is there's only 2 or 3 cases where optimism is decreased. 2 of those are among MBs, where they've had very slight decreases in their expectations around employee retention and in customer acquisition. They're a little bit less optimistic about that. And for SBs, they're also a little bit less optimistic about employee retention than they were in May. Not significantly, but it's interesting to see that directionally. And I do think that speaks to what we saw in the previous slide, especially around the staffing, where businesses are really struggling to retain staff, and we'll see that elsewhere. And that can obviously affect all aspects of business operations, not to mention top line and profitability. Another thing that we asked, and in addition to Outlook, was just kind of business concerns, so what keeps you up at night. This is a different scale. It's still 1 to 100, 0 to 100, but 0 here is good in the sense that they're not at all concerned about these various things. 100 is bad in the sense that they're extremely concerned or worried. And you can see here, it's interesting, even though they're more optimistic about their business outlook, they do have a higher level of concerns in pretty much every case. There's just 5 of these, or 6, I should say. But the biggest increases, and again, this is on a weighted basis, the biggest increases are in inflation. Overall, that's jumped quite a bit, probably not surprisingly, given everything you've heard in the news and probably experienced from May to November. Interest rates and cyber attacks, concerns about those have all increased. Again, more interesting when you look at these on a granular basis, breaking them up by company size. The biggest increases in concern are by very small businesses and small businesses as well. What's interesting, MBs are actually less concerned about pretty much everything than they were in May, with the exception of inflation. That's held constant. So there's kind of interestingly a convergence in the level of concern from small businesses to mid-sized businesses, where it's gotten bigger among smaller businesses and slightly lower, kind of surprisingly, among the biggest businesses. And again, that is to a degree consistent with what we see. Mid-sized businesses, again, those with 500 employees, do tend to be the most optimistic overall. Here, we wanted to get a sense of what are the priorities or importance of different business objectives or tasks for small businesses. The bars in blue are the results from the November survey. The orange or gold are the results from the May survey, and the order is pretty much the same. The scale is quite a bit different. Honestly, I don't know why there is such a larger degree of importance now than there was. You do see some variability in sampling. We surveyed the same firmographics in November, but a different set of respondents, so you do get some variability there. But I think the bigger takeaway here is that the scale, the relative importance of different tasks is very similar from November to May. Staying in business is most important overall. Customer acquisition, customer retention are close behind. Those remain top concerns. And again, the degree to which you can communicate or message that your solutions help SMBs with those challenges is really going to resonate that much more with them. Here, same question, we just broke out the responses by company size. So on the left, the very small businesses and the little orange dots, those just call out what's most important in that group. So for example, staying in business is most important for very small businesses, followed by retaining customers and maintaining cash flow. For SBs in the middle, in the little green columns, that's just the change in the jump since May. For small businesses, 20 to 99 employees, they are most concerned with retention, as are mid-sized businesses. So that's going to play out over and over, as a concern. And again, if you can help SMBs with that, that's a really key consideration, again, for the 20 plus employee SMB size set. For SB's second biggest concern, staying in business. Third is keeping data secure, which is interesting. That tends to be a bigger concern among the biggest businesses. And for mid-sized businesses, their second biggest concern, keeping current on customer preferences, which is interesting. That speaks to a desire to conduct market research, whether directly or either Salesforce. And keeping current on technology, a perennial challenge, especially for bigger businesses, just to understand what kinds of technology solutions are going to help them most effectively with all sorts of business challenges. We also asked about spending outlook. So here, if you look on the left, you can see the categories that we asked about. Most of these are applications, although we did ask about hardware, specifically PCs, laptops, desktops, internet access, and an orange to the other tech apples here, a loan or line of credit, and hiring sites and job boards. So little appley and orangey, but still it's interesting to see that there is a big increase from May on the left to November on the right in terms of increase in spending. The dark blue, by the way, is just the percent of folks who said they expect to increase their spending significantly in 2021 versus 2020. Versus 2020, last year. And the lighter blue is the percent of folks who said their spending, this year will increase somewhat compared to last year. And you can see that those percentages, have jumped across the board from May to November. And the biggest areas of increase are in internet access, in computers, hardware, PC, laptop, desktop computers, customer service software, and then marketing and e-commerce applications. And I think that's very consistent with what we've seen. One of the huge outcomes, of course, of the pandemic was the number of small businesses that did migrate to online selling. And we see the kind of momentum for that continue with the adoption of customer service and marketing applications. This is, I think, really interesting when you just look at, the percent of folks who are going to increase significantly or somewhat by company size. There is a little bit of a difference in, well, a couple of things. First of all, the priorities, those which are going to increase most. For VSBs and SBs, they are going to spend, they're going to have the biggest increase, I should say, in spending on hardware, PCs, laptops, desktops. For VSBs, followed by internet access and then marketing applications. For SBs, followed by data security and accounting software, so QuickBooks, Quicken kind of solution. And for MBs, their biggest increase in spending for this year is data security, and that's tied with accounting, financial management packages, and customer service software, number 3. What's also interesting is, if you look at the percent increases, those are very much driven by the very smallest businesses. If you remember the total from the previous slide, for MBs, their expectation around the increase in spending is actually decreased since May. So they still expect to spend more, and in many cases a lot more than they did in 2020, but not by as much as they did in May. The next set of questions we asked about were specific applications. Here we just said, okay, in dark blue, which applications do you have? And we asked that question in November. In gold, same question, but in May. Why internet access, for example, would have decreased a little bit, or the percent of companies would have decreased actually quite a bit. If we were using desktops since May, I don't know. It's interesting. The only alternative to that would be using, for example, just a smartphone or a or a some sort of tablet device as opposed to desktop or some other kind of device. But what's interesting, I think, if you look at the significant increases, those with the boxes, so for example, in total, 34% of respondents are using in May accounting or financial management software. 48% in November, huge jump. Likewise, big jump in document management. We lumped a bunch of categories, whether it's creation, storage, backup sharing, document signing, a big jump in utilization of those kinds of applications. Likewise, big jump in merchant processing. So, the Square and Stripe kinds of applications, again, consistent with companies moving to selling online. Big increase in utilization of loan or line of credit, which may indicate a positive outlook and expectations for growth, or for some significant fraction of the businesses, there are companies that need a cash infusion because top line revenue isn't cutting it, so they've gone out to borrow money to meet expenses. Again, big increase in marketing and e-commerce applications, customer service software, design and illustration software, really good news for folks like Adobe, that's jumped hugely, and CRM application utilization is growth as well. If you look at the same question by company size, you can see big diversity in utilization. What's interesting, if you look at VSBs, and this is also consistent with research that we've done over the years, really regardless of category, there's much more variability in implementation of different applications among VSBs than there is among MBs. So, MBs are just much more likely to use, applications in every category than VSBs are. And you can see, for whatever reason, there's actually a decrease in utilization in a few categories on the part of MBs in particular. Here we just said, okay, if you're using any of the applications that we surveyed before, overall, in aggregate, when are you most likely to upgrade them? So, getting a new version of software, or, in the case of using a loan or line of credit, for example, applying for an additional loan or asking for a larger loan. And you can see, collaboration software has the biggest plans for, upgrade by the end of this year. For 2022, it's customer service software and design and illustration software. Again, good news for the Adobe's, Canvas of the world. Here we just said, okay, since May, if you're using it, how much is your likelihood to adopt these applications change? And if you look over in the very right, the green columns, you can see that there's been fairly significant increase in adoption plans, whether it's this year or next, across the board. Few exceptions with marketing applications and with video conferencing software, as some companies have returned to the office, for example. But big increases in particular in collaboration software, in customer service software, and in CRM and Salesforce automation software. Here we said, okay, looking at application upgrade intent by company size, which do they plan to adopt if they're currently using them? And you can see, again, a little bit of variation both in adoption plans overall, just gauging the length of the different bars here, as well as which specific categories they plan to adopt. So, for example, for very small businesses, it's a tie in terms of which they're most likely to upgrade in 2022, specifically looking at next year. Customer service software, design and illustration software. For small businesses, collaboration software, they're most likely to upgrade. And for the biggest businesses, it's design and illustration software. Here we said, okay, for the folks who aren't using specific applications, when are you likely to adopt them? The big takeaway is if you look in the gray on the right, that's the percent of folks who just don't plan to adopt any of these solutions anywhere. So, for example, for the 417 November respondents who don't have a CRM solution, 2 out of 3 of those don't ever plan to get a CRM solution. So the big takeaway is, if they don't have it, as a general rule, they don't plan to get it anytime soon. With the exception of internet access 118 folks didn't have that, and actually the majority of them do plan to get it at some point, whether it's this year, next year, some point after 2022. And, again, PCs, laptops, desktops, if they don't have it, the 184 who said they don't, the majority of them plan to get one or more at some point. A little bit of variability, again, in terms of, their expectation to adopt applications, again, for non-users from May to November. You can see, if you look over on the way right, in every case, expectation to adopt these particular solutions has increased by internet access by the most, followed very closely by PCs, laptops, other kinds of technology, and document management software. And again, for those who aren't using particular applications, and the number of those varies for each of these, what's adoption look like? Same as for the folks who are using them. The bigger the company is, the more likely they plan to adopt them, at some point. And there's variability by company size in terms of which they plan to adopt. So, for example, for VSBs, most likely to get PCs if they don't have them. For SBs, most likely to get internet access if they don't have it. And for MBs, they're most likely to get CRM if that's something that they don't already have. The next thing, and we're pretty close to the end here, I know we're over the half hour, but just in terms of credit usage and intent, this is aggregate data and weighted. So we just said, okay, do you have a loan or a line of credit? And you can see 1 in 5 did in May, and now 1 in 4 do in November. So we said, okay, if you do, if you're those one of either 5 or 4, when are you most likely to upgrade it? You can see the percentage is increased from May to November. In terms of at some point they plan to quote upgrade end quote their line of credit or loan. And if they don't have one, because a little call out on the lower right, the percentage has increased pretty significantly in terms of plans to get one. So in May, only about 1 in 5 planned to get a loan if they didn't have one or a line of credit. Whereas now it looks like roughly 2 in 5 plan to get a loan at some point, whether it's this year, next year, or after 2022. And again, that dynamic can be driven in 2 different ways. It can be based on optimism, they're growing well, they need financing to support expansion, or it can be because, again, and this is going to be primarily the case in smaller businesses where cash flow is really being constrained, but they need to, for example, tap into a line of credit to pay payroll or, whatever they need. On the lower left, we did ask where they plan to get their loan or line of credit. And it's interesting, gold here is May. You can see those numbers have changed. In May, 71%, almost 3 out of 5 expected to go apply for credit at a traditional bank. And 56% did in November. What really jumped is planned utilization of credit unions, which have gone from 10% in May to 24% in November, which is interesting. Here, we just broke out those same numbers by company size. If you look across the top, those 3 sets, you can see, significantly higher utilization by bigger businesses of loans or lines of credit, as you would expect, by bigger companies than smaller, and higher expectations to, again, quote, upgrade, unquote, their line of credit or loan, whether they have one or not, the bigger the company is. And also interesting to break out, where they would go to get a loan or line of credit by company size. Again, big shift among VSBs and SBs from banks to credit unions. And in the case of MBs, again, 100 to 500 employees, big shift from alternative lenders in May who were tied with banks to credit unions. So, really interesting dynamic there. The second to last section that we'll talk through, and then the last will be around brands, but we just wanted to get a little bit of insight into hiring, specifically job site usage. So here, this is total data, so weighted, again, really reflects the outcomes or the responses of the very smallest businesses. And you can see among those who say they are currently using a job site, no real change from May to November, but For some, whatever reason, those who say they've used it in the past has increased quite a bit, and those who say they've never used it have decreased quite a bit. I think more interesting to take a look at job site usage by company size, probably not surprisingly, because very small businesses just by definition they don't hire that often. The use of job sites is significantly higher by SBs and by MBs than it is by VSBs, and conversely, VSBs are very much more likely to never have used a job site or job board than SBs or MBs are. Okay, last set of questions. We asked the degree to which respondents, again, 500 principles of SMBs, trust 49 different leading brands that market to the small to mid-sized business audience. There were 4 different response options. They could say trust very much, trust somewhat, don't trust at all, or you know what, I'm not aware of this brand, I've never heard of them. So this maps the aggregate or total response set, again weighted, so it really reflects the responses of the smallest businesses. And we've just done a scatter plot of the percent that trust very much or somewhat against the percent who are aware. And probably not surprisingly, awareness strongly correlates with trust. The dashed line, that's not a trend line, that just indicates where trust and awareness are equal. But you can see, there's a very strong correlation from 8x8, for example, on the lower left, that just has, relatively low awareness among SMBs, to Visa, which has both very high awareness and a very high level of trust. It's interesting to see Facebook is the one that's, got the highest divergence from the trend, where it has relatively high awareness, but, compared to what you would expect given the trend line, relatively low trust compared to its peers. What we also did was broke out the change in trust since May. Now, this is a different chart than the previous one because we've ignored awareness. It's implicit, but it's not called out specifically. So this is just, again, the percent of folks who either trust a given brand very much or somewhat. So what you can see here is, again, it's implicit that trust increases with awareness, going from 8x8 to Visa. But what's interesting too is the kind of variability. Trust is increased, to varying degrees, but either a lot in the case of companies like Indeed, Shopify, and Square, to not so much decreased in one case, but as a general rule, what you can see is there is a high range, really high range of brand trust from 14% in the case of 8x8 to 88% on the part of Visa. So, what that really says is VSBs tend not to be aware of a lot of smaller brands, but their awareness has really jumped in services, that have either done a really, good job of promoting themselves this year, like, Indeed, or they might have actually started to use this year for e-commerce like Shopify or Square. This is the response from the 150 small business. And you can see, again, really different dynamic from VSBs, where trust varies quite a bit and is pretty low among the least well-known brands. The range is quite a bit lower, from 35% to 90%. It's also changed less from relative from May to November relative to changes in trust on the part of VSBs. And what's also interesting is more brands are less trusted among SBs in November than they were in May. And then, continuing that trend, the bigger the business, the more they tend to trust businesses, which also, equates to being more aware of businesses. And you can see in each of these cases, by the way, the order changes a little bit. But what's also interesting is among MBs, more brands are less trusted than they were in May. Why that is, I don't know. But for example, if you go back to look at VSBs, in many cases, they're more optimistic than they were in May. And, with increase in business outlook, that tends to be associated with an increase in trust as well as an increase in purchase intent. For MBs, this dynamic is really interesting because their business outlook is also, as a general rule, more positive than it was in May. And then the last thing we did, just to pick on Google, it's really interesting, and there's no reason we did that other than it's just an interest. It's obviously a very well-known, very well-regarded and trusted brand, but it's just interesting to see how brand trust varies by different respondent attributes. So just looking by company size, the bigger the business, the more they trust Google. By region of the U.S., Google is most trusted in the South relative to the Northeast or Midwest. Among industry groups, and those were, I laid those out up at the sample specs, but manufacturing trusts them a fair amount more than professional services. By business outlook, the faster the company expects to grow, the more they trust Google. By age of business, it's interesting, and by age of respondent, the younger the respondent and the younger the business, the more trust they place in Google. And then, on personal level, interesting here, the lowest educational cohort tends to have the highest trust in Google. And politically, and this is a whole separate topic, the bifurcation in brands' political stances. But Democrats tend to trust Google much more than Republicans do. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me. I know we're a little bit over the half hour. There's a lot to cover there. Please do send me a note if you'd like a copy of this deck, or if you'd like to do a readout for your team. If there's anything you want to drill down into in particular, we'd be happy to do that. Also, let me know if Bredin can provide value as you go to market in 2022 against SMBs, whether it is by providing insights that you can use for go-to-market strategy, for understanding the customer experience, for product development, or to support outbound programs, or if you need help with the development of those outbound programs, like content or PR campaigns or collateral. Anyway, thank you again. I hope this was useful and thought-provoking. We'll be sharing more of the research that we fielded on a separate topic, specifically moving SMBs from interest to engagement with your organization in January. In the meantime, have a great holiday season, and thank you again for participating.